I call on Government Orders of the Day numbers 1 to 4.
Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Bill, Committee Stage continued. Regulatory Reform Bill, Committee Stage. Trade Safeguard Measures Bill, Committee Stage continued. Taxation, Annual Rates, Returns Filing and Remedial Matters Bill, Committee Stage.
I declare the House in committee for the further consideration of the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Bill, consideration of the Regulatory Reform Bill, further consideration of the Trade Safeguard Measures Bill, and consideration of the Taxation, Annual Rates, Returns Filing and Remedial Matters Bill. Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Speaker, the House is in committee. Kia ora tātou, no reira, te whare, a tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou, tēnā koutou katoa. Good afternoon, honourable members. Now, the House is in committee on the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Bill. Also, the Regulatory Reform Bill, the Trade Safeguard Measures Bill, and the Taxation, Annual Rates, Returns, Filing and Remedial Matters Bill. Now, members, when the committee last considered the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Bill, we had reached Part 3. The question is therefore that Part 3 stand part. I call the Honourable Member Jackie Dean.
Good choice. Good choice, Mr. Chair. Thank you very much for the opportunity to speak on Part 3 of the Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Bill.
Point of order, the Honourable Member Chris Hipkins.
I am sorry to interrupt the member who I think, genuinely believed that she had the call, but my understanding is that when this debate last concluded, or was last interrupted, there was a member in the middle of a call, or getting towards the end of their call, but had not concluded.
Well, all I can say to the honourable member is that according to the drill sheet that I have here, it said we had reached Part 3. And the question is that Part 3 stand part.
Point of order, Mr. Chair. I may be able to clarify matters.
Please do, Mr. Robinson.
Thank you. I was the member on my feet at the time, and I understand that I had 5 seconds remaining on my call, during which time I would have asked the government to support Charles Chauvel's SOP. Thank you, Mr. Chair.
Well, I guess that's a good one. I call the honourable member Jackie Dean.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The Exclusive Economic Zone and Continental Shelf Environmental Effects Bill Part 3 is where the rubber effectively hits the road with this piece of legislation, because it is the part which deals with or provides for objections to the EPA and also appeals to the High Court on questions of law. In Subpart 2 of Part 3 provides for enforcement of the Act by providing for the Environment Court to issue enforcement orders, and that's under Section 113. And also, and I'm about to refer to the Minister's SOP here, offences and penalties under Section 124 and 125, which of course with the Minister's SOP have increased from $600,000 through to $10 million. Also deals with the appointment of enforcement officers under Section 129. So it's a really important portion of this EEZ legislation, because it provides the backstop, it provides the accountability for any activities which are consented under this new regime in the EEZ and the extended continental shelf. And just for a bit of context about why this is so necessary, I think it's probably good for the House to remember that the current regulatory regime has got some significant gaps in it, which means that there are a number of activities which are currently occurring inside the EEZ which are in effect unregulated. And so The assessment of effects of activities, and that's other than fishing in the EZ, so the assessment of the effects on seafloor habitats, on biodiversity, and that might be as a result of seabed mining, is lacking. There is a gap in the assessment of effects of activities on biodiversity in the water column, and so that refers to the effects of seismic surveys on marine life. So none of those considerations are currently taken account of in legislation. Also, there is a gap in the assessment of effects of new activities on existing interests. For example, the effects of a petroleum platform on surrounding fishing and shipping, and also the management of the cumulative effects of all activities in the EEZ and also the continental shelf, as they are regulated under different and multiple regimes with a differing and a variable ability to take into account the sorts of activities in decision making. So there's a gap there. In fact, I would argue that there's quite a yawning gap, and this government back in 2006 Cabinet proceeded to the development of a legislative framework to tidy up the gaps in the regulation around activities in the EEZ. And so, I mean, why are these gaps a problem? There's not terribly much that happens in the EEZ, and we have been told that and we understand that. So why are these gaps a problem, and why is it so necessary to have inserted in this bill parts like Part 3, which provides for objections to the EPA, which is the determining body of activities, appeals to the High Court and points of law, and also provides and describes for offences and penalties. Why is that so important, and why is it a critical part of this EEZ bill? Well, there is, of course, the potential for unregulated activities, such as we have now and could have in the future, and did have during the term of the previous Labour government, to cause environmental harm. Now, that environmental harm could impact on a lot of things, on marine life, on marine habitats, and also marine biodiversity. And because of the nature of some of the activities that occurred and occur and might occur in the EEZ, well, some of those impacts could be quite severe. For example, oil spills, destruction due to dredging of the seabed of significant benthic communities. There's also, and I think this is pretty critical and germane to this bill, is there is no mechanism for ensuring public participation in decision-making around these activities. So it is beyond me, Mr Chair, why Labour and the Greens are opposing this bill. I can only come to the conclusion that Labour and the Greens in this House, in this Parliament, are quite satisfied with the 9 years of the previous Labour. Mr Chair.
I call the Honourable Member Jackie Dean.
Thank you, Mr Chair. I can only come to the conclusion that Labour, and under the previous 9 years of the Labour government, and indeed the Greens, are quite satisfied with the state of affairs, where there is yawning regulatory gaps in this legislation. They are opposing this EEZ bill, and I can only conclude that they actually don't care that much about what is happening in the EEZ. Maybe because it's so far out to sea, they don't particularly care about what happens out in the EEZ. Well, I can assure the House that this party does, and that is why this party has brought this EEZ bill to the House. Now, just briefly on Part 3, the enforcement of offences and penalties is very closely and described in some detail. And if members would have a look at Clause 113, they would see that it is quite explicit in what it requires people to do who are undertaking activities in the EZ. So, for example, requires, if there is an order made by the Environment Court or an environmental judge, it has the effect of requiring a person to stop doing something. Now, that's just a few words in this bill. What that might mean is quite a significant penalty and impact on some activity in the EEZ. So, Mr Chair, Part 3 is a significant and substantive part of this bill. Thank you.
Mr Chair.
I call the honourable